Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Envera at the board. Today we're going to be talking about the AQMD's Certified Permitting Professional Program. And this is simply a program that certifies private consultants to prepare permit applications for the AQMD. So let's get started. So as we said, the CPP program, or CPP stands for Certified Permitting Professional, or the CPP program, is a permitting credential, and it certifies private consultants who are familiar with the AQMD's permitting process. And we'll get to the term familiar and how does the AQMD determine that you're familiar with their permitting process later on down here in section 4. But just know that the CPP program is a permitting credential, and the goal is to certify private consultants who understand the process of preparing and submitting permit applications. Now, the CPP program, or the CPP credential, is part of the AQMD's permit streamlining process. And that process is in place to streamline the time and the amount of effort it takes to get a permit from the air agency. As we've talked about in previous at the board videos, getting a permit from the AQMD can be a long and windy road, and an unnecessary one for that, because it's needed to build any piece of equipment that can or will emit air contaminants. And so getting that permit is very important, but the process can be very long. So to streamline that process, the AQMD has several programs in place to shorten that process. The CPP program is just one program. There are other ones, such as the Certified Equipment Program, such as a Certified Engine Program, as well as XPP, or Expedited Permit Processing, where you can actually pay a little bit more fees when you submit your permit application, and that extra fees authorizes the engineer to work on his or her day off or overtime to process your permit application, so you can get it in a shorter period of time than if you didn't submit it via the XPP program. Now, let's talk about benefits. Some of the benefits associated with a CPP or having a CPP prepare your permit application. The most important one, because this is a streamlining program, is shorter permit processing times. And that's because when a CPP prepares a permit application, the district can be assured that it was prepared by someone who knows the permitting process. And so we have here that shorter permit processing times because it assumed that the permit was prepared by someone who simply knows the process. They know all the bits and pieces and components that need to be built or put into a permit application, and because of that, the engineer will spend less time going back and forth trying to get more information from an applicant because they have submitted a permit application that's incomplete. The second benefit is, because of that, consulting firms like to market that they have CPPs, or they like to market the number of CPPs on their staff, simply as a means to show that we have staff, or we have CPPs on staff who are familiar with the permitting process. And in addition, the AQMD actually maintains a list of all, well, it's not all, but all the CPPs who have elected to be on the list on their website. It's a pretty lengthy list. It has grown significantly in the past. And if you download that list, and I'll put a link to it below on the below this video, that will show all of the CPP consultants who have elected to be on that list. Because actually, as a CPP, you can elect not to have your name on the list. But from a marketing standpoint, consultants and consulting firms like that list, and they like to have their names on that list. But again, the benefit is simply shorter permit processing times. Now, as a CPP, the AQMD provides you with various tools and guidance documents that you need to prepare permit applications. And so some of the tools that the AQMD provides CPPs include information for submitting permit applications. Now, let's just make one thing clear here. A lot of this information is within the public domain. It lives in the public domain, and so you don't need to be a CPP to get access to this, although there is one tool that you need to be a CPP to get access to, and I'll talk about that later. But most of these tools are available within the public domain, and so anyone can go ahead and go to the AQMD's website and download these tools and use them. The problem is, can you find them? There's a lot of diamonds in the rough on the AQMD's website, and it can be hard to navigate through the website. And so we'll post a few links on the bottom to where some of these tools can be found. But the AQMD does provide information for submitting complete permit applications. They also provide tools, the tools needed to calculate air emissions. And a lot of this comes from the CPP Handbook. And we'll talk about that later, but knowing that or reading that handbook and understanding how that handbook is put together is the single best thing that you can do if you want to learn how to prepare complete permit applications. But nonetheless, within the CPP Handbook, there are tools needed to calculate air emissions, the 8 emission rates needed for criteria pollutants. I don't have it written down here, but there are also 3 emission rates needed for toxics. They also provide guidance on how to apply AQMD rules to a specific piece of equipment. Now, the AQMD also provides guidance on how the rules are organized, and I'll just take a few seconds here to talk about that. Within the AQMD, the rules are organized within regulations, and each regulation is centered around a specific topic. So, as an example, Regulation 2 is related to permits. That's where you'll find Rules 201, 202, 219, 218, 222, 212. All of those rules relate to permits. There are many more, but I'm just giving you 5. And you notice that all those rules start with 2, and those are found in Reg 2. And again, Reg 2 is related to permits. Reg 3, on the other hand, is related to fees. And so you'll have all of the rules related to fees. The most known from Regulation 3 is Rule 301, which is the permitting fees. And then Reg 4 deals with prohibitions, and it just goes down the list, Reg 20, Reg 30, and so forth. And so you're going to need to know how to apply the rules and regulations to a piece of equipment that you're trying to permit as a CPP, and the AQMD does provide guidance on that. You also need to understand how permit conditions are developed. It's most important to know that permit conditions are there to ensure that the equipment is constructed and operated in a way that ensures compliance with all the rules. The conditions are there to ensure compliance with all the rules and regulations of the air district, and the CPP needs to know how to draft and develop permit conditions to meet that goal. As we've talked about in previous At the Board videos, the overall goal of the permit processing process is so that the engineer can make a determination or arrive at a conclusion that yes, this piece of equipment can operate or be constructed in accordance or in compliance with all the rules and regulations of the air district. And during the permit processing time or the permit processing process, that's what the engineer is trying to do. He or she is trying to answer that one question. Can the equipment operate in compliance with all the applicable rules and regulations of the air district? And so those are some of the tools that the AQMD provides to CPPs. Now, a lot of this is public information. Anyone can go and read about these tools. And if you're new to the permitting process, or if you want to be sure that your applications are prepared, they're complete, then I encourage you to look through these tools. Now, there is one tool that is not available to the public, and you actually need to be a CPP to gain access to this tool, and that is the AQMD's CPP database. And that database has It's access to some of the internal databases of the AQMD. And when you're a CPP and you're preparing a permit application on behalf of a client, then you have to request access. But if you're granted access, then you can get access to some of the internal files related to that facility. And that option or that tool is only available to people holding a CPP credential. But all the other tools are available on within the public domain. Now, in section 4 here, the next section, how to become a CPP. Well, really, you just have to pass an exam. And if you pass an exam with I think the passing score is 70%, then the AQMD has determined that you are familiar with the permitting process and the rules and regulations of the Air District, and therefore they're going to certify you by giving you this permitting credential as a means to formalize the fact that, yes, you understand all the rules and regulations as they apply to permits. You are capable of preparing a complete permit application on behalf of your client or the facility that you're working with. And so again, pass an exam, you must renew it each year. No experience is required. If you study all this material and you have a little bit, you have an idea of how things are or how things work within the AQMD, and there's no experience required to take this exam. You can just pay the money, take the exam, pass, and get your credential. Likewise, there are no continuing education credits needed. Most important, you just need to renew it each year. And if you don't renew it, then you have a certain period of time, and I think it's in a Regulation 3 rule where after a certain period of time, if you don't renew, then you lose the credential, and the only way to get it back is to take the exam and then pass. But most important, with no experience and no continuing education requirements, the best way to become a CPP is to be familiar with the AQMD's permitting process. And like I said, you can just read about it. You don't have to have formal experience. And that's an important distinction, is because a lot of people have the misconception that only CPPs can prepare permit applications, and that's not right. Anyone can prepare a permit application, but only a select few, namely people who are familiar with the process, either by having a CPP or not, are able to prepare complete applications. And the AQMD is really looking for complete applications because it minimizes the amount of back and forth and questions and follow-up data requests needed to process that permit application. So you need to be familiar with the permitting process, but you don't need to be a CPP to prepare permit applications. You just need to know what's needed to prepare a complete application. And then lastly, I want to talk about exam study materials. So one of the few questions that we get here, we get asked is there a study course? And there are a few study courses out there, but in my experience, the best way to study for the CPP is to follow, these are 6 points here, and I'll go through each one of them. And if you study this and you get if you after studying all this and looking at the information, you have you're familiar with the AQMD's permitting process, then you should go and take the exam if getting the CPP is something that you're trying to do. But if not, I think it's good that you have this background information within your pocket so that you can prepare a complete permit application. So let's get started here in the last section. So number one, first and foremost, read and understand the CPP manual. And this is important regardless if you plan to take the CPP exam or not. You should simply read the manual so you understand the process of preparing a complete permit application, so you know what's ahead. You know sort of what roadblocks are ahead, and you kind of have this path paved in front of you. And a lot of people miss that. They start in this field new, or they get handed an air program within a company, and then now they need to prepare a permit application, and they don't know where to start. And the AQMD's website has a lot of good information, but the information is really hard to find. And so I often guide people to this CPP manual, and we'll have a link to it in the notes below. But that is the best place to start. And I encourage you to read that document even if you don't want to take the exam, because it gives you a very good outline of how things work at the AQMD. You also want to study sample air permit applications on their website. There are a few on their website. And you want to look at the structure. You want to look at what information is needed to go inside of a permit application so it can be deemed complete. We've talked on previous at the board videos, we've talked that a permit application has 3 components: forms, fees, and a detailed engineering evaluation. And then we've also talked about the 10 elements that go inside of that detailed engineering evaluation. And so, if your air permit has, all 3 components, then you're on a better road than most, because most people just prepare permit applications by submitting forms and fees. And then when they do that, they run into problems because they don't understand that their permit application is missing, the one part of it, a third of it, and that third is a very important piece. And so by preparing forms and fees, their application is only 2/3 complete. And so you want to study the sample permit applications on the AQMD's website so you have a better idea of what's needed to go inside of these permit applications. You also want to know how to complete a Tier 1 and Tier 2 health risk assessment. And these health risk assessments are needed under Reg 14, specifically Rule 1401. And there's guidance on the AQMD's website. There's a guidance document, and it has specific steps that you follow. It's organized very nicely. And if you follow these steps, then it will take you through the process of completing an HRA. Completing an HRA is a sequential process where you do a Tier 1, and that's simply a screening process. If it fails, then you need to go to a Tier 2. And every time the HRA fails, you need to go to a higher tier, but if it passes, then you can stop there. So as an example, if you have a piece of equipment and you need to prepare an HRA, then you would start with a Tier 1. If it passes a Tier 1, you would stop. If it doesn't pass a Tier 1, then you would need to go to a Tier 2. And then after completing a Tier 2, if it passes, then you would stop. If it doesn't, you would need to go to a Tier 3. And each one of these tiers gets significantly more complex, and more information and more effort is needed to complete them. But you need to know how to complete a Tier 1 or Tier 2 health risk assessment. You also want to know, when is a permit needed? By far, one of the most common questions that we get asked here is does this piece of equipment need a permit? And to answer that question, you really need to look at 3 different rules. We call it the trio of permit applicability rules: Rule 201, 219, and Rule 222. And you want to look at them in that order, because if a permit is needed under 201, then you want to look, does Rule 219 exempt that piece of equipment? If it does, then you can stop. Sometimes what you'll find is that you'll make it through the list, and it will need a permit, but under 201, it will be exempt from 219, but it will need to be registered under Rule 222. And so the trick to determining permit applicability is to look at all 3 of those rules in that order. Again, 201, 219, and 222. And that is, when you understand those 3 rules together, then you have a very good understanding of when a permit is needed and when it is not. You also want to know how to prepare a fee calculation. And the fee calculation is actually outlined in the CPP Manual, because you want to understand, when is a discount eligible? When is this permit application eligible for a discount? When does a penalty need to be applied? And so 2 very easy examples of a discount is that if you're submitting a permit application for 2 pieces of identical equipment, then you can use a discount where you would pay the full fee on the first piece, and then you would pay 50% on the second piece, but they need to be identical. And then in terms of a penalty would be applicable if, say, you constructed your piece of equipment without first getting a permit, and then now a few years later you want to get a permit. So now you're preparing a permit application for a piece of existing equipment. That would result in a penalty. And so you want to know when these quote fee modifiers, i.e. discounts and penalties, apply to your permit application. And again, that's all outlined in the CPP manual. Again, and then lastly, you want to understand the fee structure. You know, there are different, I think there are 10 fee categories, and there's a whole list of equipment within Rule 301. This basic equipment and control equipment. And when determining a fee or the fee needed to process this permit application, you must look at the equipment type within Rule 301, and then you must look at the fee structure. You know, is it Class A, is it Schedule A, is it Schedule B, is it D, is it E? And each one of those fee categories or structures have different fees associated with it. And so again, you want to know how to prepare a complete fee calculation within your permit application. And then lastly, you want to understand the rules and regulations. And this is where a lot of people, you know, get hung up, because there are a lot of rules and regulations within the air district. And so, you know, you want to know that, you know, like we talked about before, that rules are organized into regulations, and regulations are centered around certain topics. So Regulation 2 is permitting, Regulation 30 would be Title 5, Regulation 20 would be all the reclaim rules. So you want to know that logical structure. And then when you open up a regulation, you look at all the rules, you want to be able to scan down that list to pick out which rules apply and which ones don't relatively quickly by looking at the titles. But you want to understand how the rules and regulations are organized so that you can more quickly go down that list to know which rules apply and which ones don't. So we talked about the different rules. I mentioned the Title V and Reclaim. Those are two very big programs here in the South Coast, and those can be found in Regulation 20 for Reclaim and 30 for Title V. You also want to look at the applicability of these rules. And so, you know, what you would do when you do a rule assessment is you would simply go through all the regulations and pick out the rules that you think apply simply by looking at the name of the rule. And then what you would do is you would then open the PDF of that rule, and then you would look at the applicability to see if it truly applies in your situation. And then lastly, you would want to look at the exemptions to find out if the rule or the piece of equipment is actually exempt. And so there's a little bit of a process there to pick out which rules apply and which ones don't, because, you know, when you scroll down the list, it may look like it applies. So you may want to flag that one. You'd open that rule and you look at the applicability, and it may apply based on how the applicability is written. And then you would look all the way to the bottom at the exemption, and then you would find out that it's exempt. And so, you know, you want to note that in your notes and also in your permit application. But the gist of it is that you want to be sure that you understand how the rules and regulations are organized and how they are applied. And then lastly, you know, the second secret, so to speak, of understanding how to prepare permit applications, and more importantly, understanding how the air quality rules apply, is to read an overview of air quality regulations by a lawyer, and his name is Kurt Coleman. And Kurt Coleman used to work for the Air District. I believe he was the Air District's general counsel many years ago. He retired, and then now he's in private practice, you know, advising clients and navigating clients through the AQMD's rules and regulations. And he wrote an awesome piece on how to navigate, or how are the air quality regulations structured within California. Now, California is very, very complex when it comes to its regulatory landscape and then their air quality rules and regulations. But he does an excellent job at outlining the agencies involved, what are their roles, and then more importantly, you know, who is doing what. Because you'll find out that every regulatory agency dealing with air does something different, but no one regulatory agency has the jurisdiction over everything. So the South Coast has jurisdiction over mobile stationary sources, whereas the state has jurisdiction over mobile sources. And so in Southern California, the air quality problem is a mixture of both, but they're regulated by two different agencies. And Kurt does an excellent job at outlining how the rules are organized, and it's just a very, very good overview of how things are structured in California. And so I actually recommend folks to read that paper in addition to the CPP manual. If they don't want, doesn't matter if they want to prepare permits or they don't. You need to read those two for anyone who's practicing, a practicing air quality professional in Southern California. So there you have it, sort of the AQMD's CPP program, from what is it to the benefits of it, to some of the tools available to CPPs, to how to become a CPP, and lastly, some of the study materials that you need to review if you're interested in taking the CPP exam, or just more generally if you're interested in preparing permit applications, or you need to prepare permit applications within your facility. So until next time, take care.